Let's take a look at just a very fast example of how you might use a house of quality or a first tier quality function deployment as part of the work you're doing to conceptualize a new system or a new system concept in the opening phase of an engineering lifecycle. So this particular example is a customer management system. So let's just take a look at how that might fit. So again, recall that in house of quality and QFD, the engineering goes on before you plug things into the matrix. So first you've got to go collect the information that you need. So this is just an example. Here's a project charter listing a problem statement and some basic goals of the customer management system. This particular example uses a SIPOC, a supplier input process output customer diagram. It's largely drawn from the Six Sigma world. You don't have to be doing Six Sigma to do that. That lists and tries to conceptualize the system in terms of its inputs and outputs and the requirements for each as they go through. So this is a fairly standard SIPOC for a system flow, showing the inputs and outputs and the suppliers and customers that they are associated with, as well as some of the high-level requirements for those. So we'll need some of those requirements in building a house of quality as we move forward. Another way to represent that might just be a simple flow diagram. The exact same flows are here as we showed on the SIPOC on the page before. It's just a simpler way to do that. You just don't show the requirements on this kind of a context flow diagram. And coming up with what should the columns of it be, if the SIPOC is what we need the system to be able to furnish in terms of the requirements, a P map or a process map might be the how. How are we going to deliver against those requirements going through? So here's a layout of a potential 6-stage process where the inputs and outputs that we saw in the SIPOC have been mapped onto this diagram, so we can see in essence which of these are going to go through the different flows as we go through. So you've got everything from noise or uncontrollable inputs going in with the ends to controllable inputs that we do control, as well as some standard procedures. That's the C, the N, and the S before some of those inputs, just characterizing some of those things. And each process step is labeled in terms of whether it's value adding or non-value adding. So again, the level of detail you're putting into the engineering of your ideas during the conceptual stage will vary fairly dramatically. This one is fairly detailed going through. This is a cause and effect diagram. It shows some of the customer requirements across the top to some of the requirements for the inputs going through, so that they can be equated and related to each other, again to prioritize the relationship between the inputs and the outputs, so that we can prioritize and list some of the key inputs in terms of how important they are and how strongly they map to the different outputs. So again, we might go through a needs analysis where we identify the stakeholders and the process scope. Most conceptualizations need to identify who the stakeholders are to a given project, so you can identify their requirements. So we might then go through each of those stakeholders and come up with a list of the requirements that they have for our given system as we see our way through. So again, for the demonstration purposes, it doesn't matter what these requirements are, just that for each of the major stakeholders, we go through and maybe do a Kano analysis at the end to see what some of the key customer dissatisfiers and potential delighters are of that process. So one way or the other, we've identified the customer needs that we're going to have as our rows and some of the process conceptualization, how we, in terms of how we're going to meet some of those needs going through. We haven't designed anything, we're just laying out some process and identifying some basic requirements at this stage. So if we have those things in our engineering, however you choose to come up with them, you're then in a position to start filling in the house of quality. So here's the house of quality where I've left out the center relationship matrix. This is the left-hand requirement side and the right-hand planning side. But I'll go through for each of those requirements that we saw, each of those customer needs that we saw in our analysis. I'm going to map those needs to the system over time, but first I'm going to fill in the different characteristics we saw for prioritizing some of those things. It's a long list, but you saw in the video on how to fill out a house of quality what some of these rankings would be. And then I'd figure out how am I going to measure and what's my target threshold for each of the key requirements. How will I know the system I designed is acceptable? I now know that in the two right-hand columns that I should meet all of those thresholds and targets for each of the customer needs that I came up with. Over the standard QFD, I often add an extra column here of just overall importance, where I can put an H for high next to the top few. Largely I do that because I'm in Excel, and as you can see, this matrix gets pretty hard to read, so I often want to be able to filter it down to just those elements that received the highest scores. These are the most important. It's the exact same data here as here, but the second one is just filtered to look only at the highest priority requirements that come out as they go through. So that's one way I use the planning matrices to build that through. Then I'm going to go through and figure out, in terms of my process, my columns, what do I expect to do in terms of my process requirements going through? So I might have a marketing function and a sales function, a customer service function and finance function and managerial functions, organizational requirements. I'm going through getting my hows. How am I going to do this as I go through? And because eventually I want to fill in the columns of this house of qualities. I got all the customer needs down the side, and now I've got all my business system requirements that I've gathered across the top, and I can go through and do my rankings to come up with a raw score for each. And if I've done that in terms of my house of quality, I'm learning from this what are the important elements of my business process that I now need to move forward in the design. So given the prioritization of my needs, I'm able to come up with, again, here's just the high priority ones from amongst those. What are the high priority elements amongst those in terms of my overall process? And that's where I get my requirements critical to quality. So this, if you will, is the output of the first house of quality. So these things will become the rows of the next house of quality as I move my project forward. But as a project conceptualization, as a system conceptualization, I'm now able to say what the highest priority requirements are for things I need to design into my system in order to meet the overall customer needs that I was given in my project charter. The number here at the end is the raw score these elements had at the bottom of the matrix we were looking at. And that's what I would normalize to probably a priority 10 for this first one and let the score fall as I work my way into the next matrix. But coming out of my first house of quality, I already know which of my overall functional requirements that I've identified are going to be considered critical to quality. I must meet, these are my top 15 requirements going into that next phase. So as I move into preliminary system design and that subsequent phase, it's good to know not just what my overall structure is going to be conceptualized as, but where are the priority elements of that model as I see my way through.